The issue with self-improvement is it starts from the premise that like something about you is already like broken, wrong, needs fixing. And so if you're starting from that premise, all of the practices that you do will to some degree kind of reinforce this idea that like you perpetually need to be like healed and fixed.
Right.
As opposed to starting from what he thinks of as self-enfoldment, which is like, what if I'm actually already whole and nothing needs to be changed? And paradoxically, that state is interpreted by the sensorium of the body as, okay, like there's safety here. And that's when the kind of transformation and the unfolding occurs, and you just stay with the unfolding that happens and nothing needs to be done. So I think the underlying or the false premise of the optimizers, let's say, is that some part of them is broken and that their bodies can't be trusted to fix themselves, so they need to be managed. And the way in which we manage our own experience is actually adds more resistance and tension in the system. In the same way that like, if I was your boss and I was looking over your shoulder every 2 minutes being like, are you doing a good job? Are you doing a good job? Are you doing a good job? You'd be like, fuck you. There would be tension in your system.
Jonny Miller, thank you for joining me on The Augmented Life.
It's great to be here, Michael. I'm excited for this conversation.
I'm excited too. I'm a fan of your podcast, and you know it has taught me so much. But today, I really wanted to get into it with you as a biohacker who's worked on your own nervous system mastery and now has coached countless people in like literally upgrading their nervous system. So I guess to a certain extent, you're kind of upgrading people's perception of reality.
That's actually the aim. Yeah. And I think one of the frames that I have is that our nervous system is like, it's the lens through which we experience reality.
Right.
And there are ways that we can kind of consciously to kind of like augment this, to kind of use the title of your guys' podcast. It can be augmented for better and for worse. And understanding the mechanisms by which we can do that and creating the conditions for nervous system thriving, I think is a really valuable skill in this day and age.
Awesome. The particular intersection that I want to pursue with you has to do with augmentation with tools in the form of, things like my Aura Ring, and augmentation in the form of skills, right? So we can upgrade ourselves by literally learning new things. And I think one of the funny things about the way the mind works is that the new systems of processing actually change perception, right? It's not like perception stays the same and you just like hand it to an upgraded CPU. It seems like something about the way we change the CPU changes perception. So it gets complicated fast, right? Lots of feedback loops.
So the working model that I have is, pretty aligned with predictive processing.
Oh, excellent. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so as you say, like there's a lot of things we can do to change the types of predictions that our nervous systems and brains and minds make about the world.
I'm having a weird experience of the Bayesian brain right now. I'm speaking with a mild brain injury. I suffered a concussion 4 days ago. And it's altering my perception of reality right now. And I think the only reason why this is okay is that I've put a lot of effort, luckily, into a particular style of meditation, into non-dual Vipassana, systematically on the sense gates. So I just had this practice of what's sometimes called calm abiding as my own, as I see my perceptions glitch. So the fact that right now, like my proprioception is all off. I'm having dizziness for no reason, which should, I think earlier me would have a whole bunch of fight or flight responses. And so it's only because of practice that I can be like, that's weird, but moving on.
Wow. Well, I'm impressed that you're able to kind of have the coherence for a podcast in this moment. I'm not sure I am that skilled.
Well, I've been resting. I think I'm bringing it for right now, and then I'm going to sort of run out of battery
Mhm.
But the my own understanding of this experience is that I think that the the predictive processing model is probably correct. My brain is mostly developing, just a model of what's going on. And and then what what makes this so, I think, effective for me is that I don't have to believe in it, right? So like it is patently the case that my model is failing right now. Like the dizziness is purely in my head. So since I've learned to not be sticky about it and like believe in the reality of my model's failure, I think it's a little bit easier to let it go.
Yeah, and also I imagine like a greater space between stimulus and response that you've kind of developed as well. I imagine that's part of it too, that
Right.
there's not these knee-jerk reactions to what this might mean, but there's just a greater sense of spaciousness. And my experience, and maybe this will get too nerdy. I don't want to go down the deep end, but okay, great. Well, I've become friends with an amazing theoretical neuroscientist, Michael Edward Johnson, and he's kind of developed some theories that layer on top of predictive processing around latch development.
Ooh, okay.
His the kind of like I don't want to butcher it too much, but the TLDR version is that our vascular system creates latches in the smooth muscle tissue anytime that we're unable to be present for our kind of experience. So and his view is that this is essentially what trauma looks like in the body,
I
and
see.
that these latches correlate with physical tension. And practice like vipassana and kind of going through the senses is one of several practices to, I think, systematically notice where these latches are, these kind of points of tension, and recreate a sense of safety in the system, and kind of opening up these latches for greater degrees of complexity in the predictive processing. And it's a much more complex way of describing the work that I'm trying to do with nervous system mastery, which is essentially, I think, creating the conditions of embodied safety for these latches to safely open and release for a kind of like essentially more aliveness and like higher definition experience of reality to come through.
Right, right. That is my subjective experience as well, is that development along these lines seems to open up almost like higher definition perception. And when I was a young analytical boy, I was in such denial of it. This all just sounded like such woo, you know? And I think I was modeling myself as a little stick figure supporting a brain, right? And
Yes.
the purpose of my body was to just lead my brain around, but my brain was
Brain on a stick. Yep. That's exactly what I teach in my program as well. I mean, that was my model too. It's like the purpose of my brain or the purpose of my body is like help, like be a vehicle for my brain to move through the world.
right, yes. Yeah. So I felt like I had to start practically I like learning to feel like getting in touch with how just not at all somatically grounded I was felt like confronting the fact that I was just like a child, like just a baby. Like, oh, I need to. Oh, oh, emotions are embodied. Oh, I somehow went several decades without noticing that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a relearning process, right? Because all humans come into the world with that kind of sense of somatic awareness intact. And I think usually up until, at least the ages of like 3, 4, 5. And it's really, at least from what I've seen, it's more kind of the schooling ages and eras where the cultural conditioning and conditioning from parents kind of comes in, that we learn to suppress certain emotional experiences. And then eventually, maybe some people have experiences where they feel like the body isn't safe, but the head and the mind is safe. And so they learn to spend their time more up there. And we're also culturally and societally rewarded for being in the mind as well, like giving correct answers. And so it's not surprising that I think a lot of people's experience is really of just, through the head and the mind and the brain, and much less in the body.
Yes, I think that's right. Now, because of that, it seems like in your role as a teacher, you're almost swimming against a cultural tide, right? So how do you bust past the barrier that to reach people at this level that almost makes this a topic that they can engage in, and it doesn't just sound like New Age mysticism?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And I've thought about this a lot, and also the right way to approach people. The honest answer is I think that suffering on some level plays a role.
Hmm.
And the frame that I have is I think about it like a feather brick dump truck kind of analogy, in that some people just require like a tickling of a feather to feel like something is slightly off, to have the curiosity to like go and explore, maybe there's something more here. For other people, maybe it's a brick, maybe it's a breakup or losing a job. And for other people, it's a dump truck. It's like intense burnout. It's a health crisis. It's like losing a loved one. That was kind of my path into this.
Mm-hmm.
And in those moments, there's a sense that this model of reality that I had constructed for myself no longer kind of works. And so there's almost like a humility and like a humbling of like, okay, that there needs to be another way here. And I think that's often what draws people into, whether it's meditation or plant medicine or breath work, these types of modalities that are, were certainly very fringe 15, 20 years ago. And now they're becoming more and more mainstream.
Right. I feel, I think there are arguments against what I'm about to say, but I do feel validated that improvements in both brain wave monitoring, so EEG style monitoring, as well as structural scanning, have shown that certain kinds of meditation practices clearly, literally alter the structure of your brain, right? Which sort of helps establish like, no, this has to be kind of like the brain equivalent of going to the gym. Like, look, the neurons are different now. That my insular cortices are literally denser.
Yeah.
So that's nice. Like I think I have there's a little inner, some inner Buddhist teacher voice is going, bah, you're just once again, applying an arbitrary set of labels to add significance. Like, oh,
Right.
good job. You can use these science words, so that means it's real. Go ahead and reify that.
But I think it's actually also very helpful and reassuring to have the quantitative backup, kind of our subjective experience. And I think, that's actually one of the, I'd say the main challenges, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but there aren't great ways of measuring what I think of as nervous system dysregulation. It's kind of a constellation of symptoms. And one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by Mike Johnson's work is because the theory is that if we were able to create a blood flow map of someone's physiology, we could kind of identify these like the signatures of these latches, and those latches, or the amount of latches that someone has, would essentially be how much tension they're holding in the body. And I think it would have a very high correlation to how much dysregulation they were experiencing in their life. And so my hope is that, maybe a few years down the line, if this theory, it is just a theory, but if it pans out, that we would be able to, really quantify the before and after difference of various somatic interventions using the whole body, and not just, looking at which parts of the brain might light up.
I think that is a great idea. And I'll throw out a prediction here. It doesn't have to come in the form of a wearable. I bet you could construct a model that interprets visual light. So I think holding your body in tension is essentially visible to a camera.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be surprised if you could actually construct a longitudinal model of a person being more or less tense, and really you're just running AI against images to get this done.
Yeah, I've considered that too, and I know Mike also thinks that the eyes particularly kind of reveal a lot of data about someone's nervous system, and if you could have like very high definition scans of someone's eye, maybe again like AI models could learn
Yes,
what the correlations are here. So I think it's, particularly with AI kind of advancing at the pace that it is, I think it's a very exciting time to be exploring this space.
we might run an experiment like this with Fulcra, actually, that's just based on taking selfies of your face. 'Cause I think there's a lot of interesting data points. There's something you can get out of muscle tone just looking at eyelids. There's a lot to read here. Plus, there's some subjective indicators that, for instance, people who practice, meditation, like, literally change the way their resting face looks.
For sure. Yeah. 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 And I mean, I've, from my own experiences with breath work, let's say I've done, hundreds and hundreds of hours of journeys at this point. The amount of muscular freedom and sensitivity and awareness that I have, particularly in the lower parts of my body, kind of from like the diaphragm downwards, is,
Right.
multiples greater than what it used to be.
Ah, right. Okay, so, I think that's just an area of open work. The accessible quantitative measure, I think, for a lot of people right now really is HRV, right? So now we have multiple wearables that will look at heart rate variability and then compute it to be an indicator of, variously stress or strain. Um, it the Sometimes those measures are also, of course, augmented with the accelerometers to try to get a sense of your movement relative to your HRV. Uh, are you seeing that as a useful measure? Is that, like, are you seeing any before and afters with people you've coached or in yourself when it comes to those numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the important piece to be aware of here is that, like, it's really the kind of resting baseline trend data that's useful versus kind of individual spikes, which I
Right.
think is more just noise. But I do think that there is a pretty decent correlation between, for myself, I saw like a 25-ish% kind of increase in my baseline on the other side of doing quite a bit of intensive somatic work.
Awesome.
And that's definitely been a pattern in my students as well. I don't have the data to know if that lasts in the long term for them. Like, that's something I'd like to get. But actually the best interpretation I've heard about in this realm was from a friend of mine. He's also a guest teacher, Marek Doyle, and he talks about this principle of basically like energy security and energy scarcity, and that as the gap between the amount of energy that's required by the metabolism and by the body, as that gap increases, HRV kind of goes down and down and down. And so he works with people to kind of both restore metabolic function to kind of create more available energy in the beginning. And then the real thing that causes HRV, or one of the things that causes HRV to go down, is if the body, or if parts of the psyche, to kind of use the frame of internal family systems, are on fight, flight, kind of hypervigilance, like always tracking for danger, don't feel safe, that will create a huge amount of energetic demand for the body. So the system will be using, 50-60% more energy than it needs to, because it's constantly kind of scanning for threats, or a part of the psyche is scanning for threats. And so as those parts can be gradually welcomed back, reintegrated into kind of the whole, this kind of like fight flight response decreases, and you see a corresponding increase in HRV as a result of that.
Ah, that's fascinating. Ooh. Ooh. And obviously uncorrelated with, let's say aerobic exercise. So like if you're seeing moves like that based on practices like that, the causality is probably pretty easy to establish. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like the mechanism makes sense to me to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah. I too have noticed also that one of my strongest wellness indicators is actually just, um, the lowest resting heart rate that I'm achieving in the night, for instance. So, the all of these numbers are super noisy, right? So if I had to get reductive, like I've noticed, yeah, all right, two nice heart health indicators.
Yeah, so one kind of nuanced point I just add, that there is also, in some cases, where HRV can go really, really high, and that's actually an indication that someone's in a freeze state. So it's kind of like a deeply reactive dorsal freeze state where they're kind of fully disassociated, maybe in some kind of functional freeze, and HRV will look, it'll look great, quote unquote.
Whoa!
But it's actually a kind of, it's like deep dysregulation. So that's also, there's certain kind of edge cases that you have to be aware of, which make HRV a kind of like, it's not a perfect proxy for nervous system health.
Oh, okay. All right. So, I mean, and this is also the kind of thing that it only becomes learnable after you've helped enough people that you run into edge cases, right? Quantify that for us. So, since you started teaching nervous system mastery, how many people have you coached?
So we've had, over 1,300 students go through the training.
Right.
And
nice.
so these are people who've kind of been on live calls and things. And I've had, dozens of one-on-one breathwork clients and dozens of one-on-one, more like founders, CEOs, kind of high-performing types that I coach on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah. Okay. And then can we delve back into that weird edge case? So, tell us more about what you've learned from, let's say, the extremely dysregulated.
Sure. So there's essentially kind of like two modes of nervous system reactivity, kind of when that energy gap is, like when it gets kind of quite, let's say, just like quite high, then typically it's like a hyper arousal, kind of like a sympathetic over response. And symptoms of that would look like anxiety, overwhelm, kind of unable to downshift, constantly kind of on edge, very, very reactive. And then if that gap increases further, it's almost like the analogy that I like is it's kind of like pulling on the emergency handbrake. And that's what's known as like, in polyvagal theory, which has some issues, but I think like directionally it's correct. It's like dorsal shutdown is what they call it. And it's like, it's either a collapse response or a freeze response. Collapse is when it's just like intense parasympathetic. Freeze is when the sympathetic is still activated. So this is kind of like underlying activation, but there's also a kind of like freeze mechanism in there as well. And, my guess is there's a lot of people out in the world today who are kind of walking through life in what I think of as like a functional freeze state, where there's a level of disassociation. There's often like numbness is associated as well. People who like aren't really aware of any sensations in their body. It's tricky, very hard to access states of connection with either self or others. So even, things like prolonged eye contact can be challenging. There's often a lot of tension in the system as well. And as I mentioned, in those free states, HRV can be very, very high. So it's, that's like one thing to watch out for. And then in terms of, I think of like, I don't know if you want to go into this, but thawing that state is essentially about kind of, again, it really comes back to creating a sense of safety in the system. And usually like bringing in some, whether it's like stretching or basically practice to like come back into the body. And then often what will happen is there will be a kind of like oscillation or ping-ponging between the hyperarousal and the hyperarousal. So the kind of dorsal shutdown and the activated kind of fight-flight state. Right. And people will, in the beginning, especially if let's say someone's been working for 5 years super intensely, they've been at a startup or something, they hit burnout. The recovery process will be this kind of like oscillation between the shutdown state and the kind of overactive hyper arousal state. And that will kind of gradually return to baseline as their window of tolerance increases. And the window of tolerance, you may or may not be familiar with, it's a very, very helpful heuristic for to what degree is one able to remain grounded and present with their lived experience.
Right. If you'll allow me, I think sometimes about the treatment here, like when I'm trying to help someone who's burned out, there's what I'll think of as mind first, or sometimes maybe you could call this like top down. So the mental techniques of, for instance, you can experience pain or fear, and instead of internally running from it, you can go into it, right? This is a mind process. Then, since obviously these dysregulated states involve not just neuronal action but also hormones, there's just tremendous number of bottom up things that you can do that are almost just like making the body do different things to change the chemical soup that the brain is swimming in, right?
So I love this. It's a really important topic, and there's actually, I believe there's 4 times more efferent neurons than afferent neurons, and efferent neurons are the ones going from the body to the brain, and afferent are going from the brain to the body. And so I think of almost this like super highway network of neurons going from the body up. And so, at least to my mind, like body-based physical interventions have a pretty good chance of changing our state, and then changing the thoughts and the stories that we have, which are often kind of keeping people in these like reinforcement, like negative spirals, loops in their mind. So if someone is, experiencing, let's say, anxiety often, having interventions that are specifically body-based, so things like extended exhale practice, humming is really good. Long hold, like forward fold stretches are also great. There are various practices that reliably activate the parasympathetic response, which, as you say, changes blood chemistry and then makes its way across the blood-brain barrier and changes the types of thoughts and feelings that people are having. And so it then kind of creates this much more virtuous cycle. And then this can, of course, be stacked with top-down practices like I'm a big fan of like expanding awareness, or moving your awareness to like the hands and the feet, or there's a whole range of different techniques and practices, or reframing what's happening in a more positive,
Right.
There's a ton of these.
Right. Is there, so I think you can learn these practices, which are solid, almost like, whatever tools in the toolkit, but it's still hard in the moment to remember to do it. That this feels like the best place for technology, right? It is like, man, I wish I had a monitoring anything at all, like just an extra brain augmentation that said like now's the time to do a little box breathing or whatever it is, right? Is anything good? Like, is anyone working on that kind of like the digital tools to do the triggering?
Yeah, so I sent out a tweet a while back that was kind of a joke, but it was like, imagine if you had a wearable device that did exactly that. Like it beeped before you're about to say a shitty thing or make a bad decision, or like, I don't know, like blow up some relationship. And I think we do have that. I think that it's called interoception. I think it's developing that, you could call it a psychotechnology maybe, but it's like a capacity, and specifically knowing for yourself what are your somatic markers. And by that I mean, what are kind of like, what's like the canary in the coal mine? What are like the early warning signs of when you're in a 2 out of 10 reactive state, and not waiting for the 9 out of 10 kind of explosion. And I find that doing practices, and specifically writing down and journaling on like what are the early warning signs that you notice, and they can be really subtle things, like maybe it's like your toes clench a little bit, or your throat gets a little bit tight and dry, or there's like a little bit of a knot in your stomach. Like they're actually quite subtle in the beginning, and the more that you can attune to these, the more that you can take that kind of like you can stage interventions using some of these practices while it's still doable. Like once you're at the 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, it's much harder to come back into it.
Right.
Like to be regulated enough to remember to do a practice.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like that, that seems that matches my own experience. Like I will eventually remember, I can just do X, and then it works.
Yeah.
But there was all that suffering in between.
Yeah. And then the second point on that is that doing the practice in a very low stakes environment and really noticing the difference between the before and after. Like if you can actually feel the difference of like slipping into a parasympathetic, relaxed, regulated state versus, whatever it was like 5 minutes before the practice, that will also kind of train your system of like, oh, like I remember last time I did that, I felt really good. So I'm going to try that again. So I think it is important to do the practice in kind of safe, non-triggering environments and situations.
Right, right. Oh, yeah, because there's two forms of, I think we just touched on the two different forms of feedback loop. When you have a journaling practice, it's like you don't even need to read the journal. Like it's like you're training your recognition process. Like forcing yourself to write it down means you're going to process what you observed in a way that can be memory forming.
Mm.
That helps you make the trigger. Then my interpretation of what you're describing here is that doing the practice in a nice safe environment helps a reward trigger, like, "See, this is a good thing." It's almost like marshmallows.
Yeah, totally. And it's training. It's training the metacognition piece as well. And going back to what you said, or something that you mentioned earlier on in the conversation, I think that the end game of this process. So I almost think of it as like there's like there being three core skills to, let's say, nervous system mastery. The first is the interoceptive piece that we've just been talking about around cultivating that kind of internal attunement, tracking somatic markers, listening to the feedback of your body. The second is having a toolkit of these self-regulation practices. They can
Mhm.
be top down or bottom up that kind of bring us back into that window of tolerance where we're no longer totally hijacked. And then the third piece is what you mentioned earlier, which was around like almost like moving towards and welcoming and embracing the whatever the uncomfortable feeling that we're kind of avoiding is. And it's very hard to do that without being somewhat regulated and without being kind of somewhat in your body.
Ah, right.
But once there's some degree of safety online, like you said, the move is really to kind of like go into the center of that feeling that we're afraid of and allow our bodies to express, move, feel, make sound, whatever it needs to do to complete that mobilization reflex
Right.
and reintegrate the psyche.
Right. Okay, so now I'd like you to distinguish between the, let's say, positive case of self-regulation from just a new thing to be nervous about, which is, optimizing your nervous system, right? Like, do you end up getting students who are just like fanatic over optimizers?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, how do I answer that? There's a couple of I'll maybe start by sharing this frame and then see where we go.
Okay.
There's a frame that I learned from a great teacher called Steve March, who comes from the kind of like Gurdjieffian fourth way
Huh.
approach. And he has this idea of self-unfoldment as opposed to self-improvement.
Ooh.
And his point, which I think is fantastic, is that the issue with self-improvement is that it starts from the premise that like something about you is already like broken, wrong,
Right.
needs fixing. And so if you're starting from that premise, all of the practices that you do will to some degree kind of reinforce this idea that like you perpetually need to be like healed and fixed.
Right.
um, as opposed to starting from what he thinks of as self-unfoldment, which is like, what if I'm actually already whole and nothing needs to be changed? And paradoxically, that state is interpreted by the sensorium of the body as, okay, like there's safety here. And that's when the kind of transformation and the unfolding occurs, and you just stay with the unfolding that happens.
Right.
And nothing needs to be done. So I think the underlying or the false premise of the optimizers, let's say, is that some part of them is broken and that their bodies can't be trusted to fix themselves, so they need to be managed. And the way in which we manage our own experience is actually adds more resistance and tension in the system. In the same way that, like, if I was your boss and I was looking over your shoulder every 2 minutes being like, are you doing a good job? Are you doing a good job? Are you doing a good job? You'd be like, fuck you. There would be tension in your system. So I think it's like, that's actually an important piece. And so the way that I think about kind of the biohacking space and wearables is that, things like Oura rings, HRV is great in the beginning for giving you kind of like a baseline, almost like training wheels. But ultimately, you really want to be able to pay attention to your own interoceptive awareness and trust your own intuition of like, what do you need? How rested are you? How are you feeling? And in the beginning, certainly tracking HRV and things like that, it can be very reassuring. So it's like, okay, yeah, I I woke up this morning, I felt pretty tired, and my HRV was below my baseline. Great. So yeah, that was maybe a bit of a roundabout answer to your question, but that's what came to mind.
Oh, I loved it. I think I had a certain pursuit of improving my intuition that was based on a like greedy pursuit of self-optimization. My logic was the whole of my brain is greater than the part that knows how to think in words. So tuning into my intuition is actually like a secret move that's going to make me smarter and outperform everybody, right? So it's very much a competitive frame. Like, oh, there's yeah, I abandoned all the conceits that try to make you distrust your brain, and privilege, only Cartesian reasoning. And that was eye opening. I was like, all right, great. I'm gonna harness my intuition to be a badass decision maker. But the I've actually made way more progress while having no goal at all except curiosity. Like, when I just get curious about how my brain works, then the curiosity is rewarded. But I think a secret of that is that it's agendaless. I'm just like, I don't need to be a different person. There's nothing to fix. I'm just gonna go where it gets weird and see what happens.
That's such a key point. And for me, in my practice as well, for a long time I went into doing breath work and all this stuff with a pretty like a background change agenda. I was kind of doing this because I wanted to like feel differently on the other side. And again, that really does create that kind of subtle resistance and tension in the system. Yeah, it's such a. There was another thing that just popped up in my mind around that as well. Maybe it'll come back, but yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and it's definitely something that I see as people kind of go, oh yeah, on the curiosity piece.
Yeah.
I mean, I call my podcast Curious Humans. I'm obviously a huge fan of curiosity, but I think that specifically courageous curiosity is almost like the magic ingredient for this type of work, because often it can take a degree of courage to want to explore the physical sensations that might be associated with grief or shame or helplessness, and to be able to like lean into and kind of move towards those in like a welcoming way, especially in the beginning. There's a way in which it takes courage, but it also takes this kind of open-hearted, agendaless curiosity as well.
Yes. Ooh. Yeah. I found that it takes courage to flail in front of someone, like, but of course, if you want to get good at anything you're not already good at, there's going to be this intermediate period where you're flailing, right? So yeah, there's something about, it's almost like bravery is ontologically prior to learning.
Yes. Yeah. Well said. Beautiful.
Well, speaking of curiosity, we've covered a lot of ground here. Tell people listening how to find you, I guess, across two tacks, right? So, I love your content series. So, please tell us more about Curious Humans, as well as where to follow up about your work on nervous system mastery.
Yeah, totally, Michael. I mean, this has been such a fun conversation, honestly. The best place for listeners to find out more would be, the website is nsmastery.com. And on that, there is links to the free self-assessment, the kind of NSQ self-assessment that'll give folks a kind of objective baseline of like where they're at in some of these areas that we've spoken about. There's also a link to the State Shift app, which is still a bit rough around the edges. We're still kind of like working out some kinks, but it has a bunch of really helpful somatic-based practices for up and down regulating the nervous system. And then there's some writing on there, and there's also the cohort-based course that I run twice a year. That's kind of like my attempt to share a bunch of this stuff in a pretty condensed 5-week period. We're finishing it, the spring cohort tomorrow. So it's been a fun run. Yeah. Yeah. And then the Curious Humans podcast, there's particularly the episode with Michael Johnson, I think would be interesting, and then also some other somatic coaches and philosophers and poets. There's a whole bunch of folks on there as well.
Very cool. Yeah, I've learned a lot from your guests. So thank you for
Me too.
making that, and keep it coming.
Yeah. I mean, selfishly, I learn a lot myself. That's why I do it.
All right, Jonny Miller, thank you.